out to Socrates. Socrates still trying to get the opening. Oh, Socrates! Whoa!
And there it is. The crazy gang have beaten the Culture Club.
Maggie Thatcher, can you hear me? Maggie Thatcher, your boys took a hell of a beating. Your boys took a hell of a beating.
Welcome to La Pausa, our laid-back saunter through the history of South American football. Our first series is a collection of discussions entitled Encounters, wherein we consider the interactions between the game in South America and Europe. Sometimes friendly, occasionally ferocious, but always fascinating. For those of you who listened to part one, again, it was another history/South American cultural lesson from Dr. Pete Watson, with myself, Gary Thacker and Stephen Scragg, all in attendance, all at the front of the class, all listening and learning. So without further ado, before I introduce the main protagonist of this story, Gary, welcome to this edition.
Thank you, buddy. Yeah, just as we were saying before we came on air, just went down a rabbit hole doing the research on this, and fascinating subject, fascinating. Can't wait to get into this one. It's going to be great.
It is. What I'm going to do is I'm going to let Pete introduce the topic again, like he did last week as well.
Good stuff.
He introduces it a lot better than I do, and he has that certain Spanish accent / South American accent that he can throw in there. With my North Yorkshire / Hull accent, it doesn't quite sound the same. But before that, Mr. Stephen Scragg. Stephen, welcome.
Well, I'm looking forward to this, and I think the school analogies as well. A few of us got into trouble as well for not paying full attention and messing around a little bit. But I've come armed with my Captain Caveman T-shirt tonight, so I'm in full Hanna-Barbera mode tonight. So yeah, best of luck, Stu. Best of luck.
I'm okay with that. That's how all South American files should. There should always be links to Hanna-Barbera, because that's just what we do. And really, we should be at the back of the class. We're the kids who just tune in every now and then, when there's something that ever so slightly interests us, or we can apply it to a cartoon. Gary's the guy at the front who absolutely loves life at the front of the class, applying it all to politics and history. And you and I are at the back, twanging rulers on the edge of the desk to make that noise, and then we're just tuning in every now and then when something funny applies.
Yeah, I'm going to dig in the ribs and say, "What did he just say that then?" Did he say that?
Yeah, that's pretty much how it goes. I suppose to Sir and the teacher of the class. Hi, Mr. Watson. It's Dr. Pete Watson.
For you.
It's Dr. Pete Watson. Pete, welcome. And whenever you're ready, just a little intro about this episode.
Yeah, and I'd just like to thank Gary for the apple that you left on my desk, and just I'm going to be throwing bits of chalk and board rubbers at you two.
Yeah, I've got an eye for it. Eye for apple.
Wait till he finds what I've left in his drawer. Then. Don't put your hand in there without looking, Pete. Don't do it.
No, so this week, after we kind of talked about the various, well, mostly British teams, but a few European teams as well that headed across the Atlantic to South America, we thought it'd be only right to talk about the first South American teams that headed back across the ocean waves to the old world to kind of bring their own football lessons. So yeah, the aim this week is going to be to talk about the various South American teams that did that. We're going to be focusing on kind of it's actually only really a 6-year period, but we're more looking between 1925, which is when the very first teams headed off from South America, and up to 1931. We originally were going to do up to World War II, and then we found there was a kind of a bit of an empty space between 1931 and then the first tours that happened after the Second World War. But yeah, that's the aim for today's episode.
Excellent, thank you. I'm sure Steve and I will tune in every now and then to what's being said. So obviously in the previous episode, Pete, it was British clubs going across. Obviously it was the mighty Saints that were spreading the word of football to South America and made Argentina what it is today as a footballing powerhouse. Obviously all thanks to Southampton. So, there was the Lumaries, Motherwell, Tottenham went, Everton went, Exeter City went. Obviously, Gary's boys went and wrecked it for everyone right at the end, for those who were listening last week. But obviously, the first one, or certainly the major debut of South American clubs, obviously, is the mighty Boca Juniors, which obviously brings a bit of gravitas. But before we get into this, more, like we said, it's 1925 when the sort of roles are reversed. They don't go to England or to the UK. It's Spain, Germany, and France where they go. But my first point, my first question really is, it's 20 years from the first arrival of a British club, but it's 20 years before Boca go back across to Europe. I suppose just a little bit of background as to why it took so long, or what those 20 years were about.
Yeah, I think really what you've got is a kind of a period of confidence gaining. One of the things we talked a lot about last week was just how much the South American sides felt in awe of certainly their British visitors. There was a lot of ideas of the cradle of the game's experts and teachers coming to teach us the game, and we're going to learn their science, and can we compete with these masters of football? We're very much the pupils and they are the masters. Very much like the classroom analogy we've been talking about today so far. So, we have that as very much the idea. So we have this kind of hierarchy and trying to get hierarchy. And I think really what you see is that before certainly 1914 in Exeter, there is still a sense of inferiority that is gradually dissipating. It's probably more the case that Brazil has that, if we were to kind of look at the ways in which the newspapers are responding. Possibly Uruguay and Argentina seem to be gaining a sense that there is a little bit less to be learnt from some of these teams, or perhaps they're ready to play against some of the bigger teams. And then the other really main reason is World War One, which obviously, destroys a lot of the kind of the youth of Europe. Destroys a lot of the infrastructure, the safety. There's obviously a rebuilding period in which Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil are doing pretty well economically. They were obviously not directly involved in the First World War, so their economies have got very strong. Certainly Uruguay are in a kind of boom period. They've kind of built a lot of facilities for sport, for example. We'll talk a little bit about how that's had an impact on the Nacional team that actually goes at the same time as Boca, as do Paulistano, the Brazil team. But so I think those are the main reasons. But I think after those, the first early tours after World War One, where we talked about Teplice, the Federación Guipuzcoana going across, I think they start to see that they can travel. And I think really the final impulse that they get is from the 1924 Olympics. And again, we're going to talk about that in a later episode of the series. But Uruguay go across. They're the only South American team to compete in the Olympic Games in 1924. They win it, and then suddenly they're aware of, right, we're good enough, we can compete at this level. The Uruguay team has got absolutely huge praise from all the Europeans that saw them. We can make a success of this. We've earned our right to go and tour.
Gary, for me, again, just like a little side issue there as Pete chats, I suppose World War One, but that impact that it has on Europe, as Pete mentioned there, the decimation of youth. But then you compare and contrast that with South America, and they're relatively untouched by the conflict in terms of casualties. And I suppose there is that period, probably certainly 4-year period while the war's on, plus obviously the repercussions afterwards and consequences that come with immense loss of life. And there's a real period there where South America can really grow, not just in terms of football, obviously, but in commerce, infrastructure, and I suppose it's something that, for me personally, that hadn't really sort of equated or thought about the impact of World War One on South America.
Yeah, it's interesting, going up through these the dates of these tours and how they happened and why they happened, and perhaps more importantly, why they didn't. If you don't sort of tie them into major world events, there's the influence that they have on it. For instance, Pete mentioned that it's sort of ground to a halt around 1931, and the Depression, was obviously a massive factor, after the Wall Street crash, and there's the things like that sort of, had a massive effect, as did the World Wars, World War One particularly, and Spain, the South American countries did prosper financially when the European powers were locked into this conflagration, and a very similar thing happened in World War II with Spain and Franco, because they weren't involved. The sales they had, the exports they had from Spain, multiplied massively because they were supplying the belligerent powers. And yeah, I think it's massively important to understand this and why there's such a gap. I mean, World War One ended in 1918, but it's not over then. The after effects of that, the consequences, the fallout and the edging towards a recovery, isn't instantaneous. And by the time we talk about 1925, when the first two Bock arrives in Europe in 1925, it's the World War One. The consequences of that are still lingering on. Obviously, cause such a devastating effect on the European economies.
And Stephen, we in the previous episode 1, we talked a lot about how quickly South America learns, not from a footballing perspective, but also how quickly it develops its sense of place and worth on a global scale. Pete mentions there, which we are going to look at in more detail, the 1924 Olympics. But certainly, if you think it's 1905 when Southampton go 1924 Olympics, it's 19 years. South American football is very quick to learn and very quick to establish itself and sort of identify, as we mentioned before, parity with European football.
There's a very quick sorting the order out at home, in South America of that hierarchical system that we've mentioned. And then as soon as that's kind of happened, the one of the two epicenters, both epicenters really, Argentina and Uruguay, they're amongst the first to kind of like stretch the legs and go out and challenge themselves across in Europe. But I mean, there's no coincidence that that first wave of South American touring teams comes between 1925 and the early 1930s. 1925, it's the year after Uruguay win that first Olympic gold. They win it again in 28. They win the World Cup in 1931, and then it starts to kind of like ebb away. For multiple reasons. We'd have to kind of like explore. But yes, I think there is a very much a kind of, it's almost like a space race. In some respects, there you've got Argentina, there you've got Uruguay, who's going to be the first one to the moon.
Yeah, very much the space race for its day. Pete, we do have an episode with regards to the Olympics and those early Olympic games and Uruguay's success. But obviously, the first Olympics where Uruguay win that gold medal is 24 in Paris. How much, without going into too much detail, but how much of an influence is that success behind? Originally, it's Argentina as a national team is asked to go, but Boca end up going to represent Argentina. But how much is Uruguay's success sort of the catalyst for that belief and that confidence for Argentina under the guise, obviously, of a single club to go to Europe?
I think it's huge. I mean, I think Stephen's analogy of the space race is a perfect one. I mean, we have to bear in mind that Paulistano are going at the same time as well. There are all three of the big clubs are heading over, and there's a matter of days between their first games. I think it's something like the 5th of March is Boca's first game. I think the 8th of March is Nacional's game. Paulistano is a few days after that. So, we do have these three kind of, incipient giants before they were giants, heading over at the same time. But a lot of it is due to the fact that Uruguay have created this impression. The newspapers were raving about Uruguay. And again, you have to think about the relationship between Argentina and Uruguay here. Argentina very much sees itself as the older brother of Uruguay, which is seen as the small Oriental republic. So Argentina are quite glad in some ways the fact that South American football is getting attention. But at the same time, you could probably say they're very envious that it's Uruguay and not them. So it's almost like it should have been us. And it's only really because Uruguay have won the 1923 Copa America that one of their kind of presidents of their football federation, who is also the president of Nacional, incidentally, and a politician as well, Atilio Narancio, says, if we win the South American Championships, we'll go to the Olympics. So we kind of get the same thing from Argentina and Brazil saying, money's to be made here. Obviously, Uruguay can do it. Uruguay have won it. We're as good as Uruguay, so we need to go as well. And there is that kind of a rush, I think it's in January pretty much. There are 3 steamers that head out from Buenos Aires, from Montevideo, and I think Rio, if I'm not mistaken, across to Europe. And then as soon as they're there, they start playing, and there is a real excitement. This is 3 teams at the same time, 3 big names as well. from these three countries. And there is this kind of comparison going on. What you do see, particularly in the countries where there is a little bit of crossover, which is mostly just France, actually, that France is the only country where Boca, Nacional and Paulistano all play. There are various other, Nacional actually play in 9 countries, Boca just play in 3, so do Paulistano. So France is possibly best placed to compare, having also been the host of the 1924 Olympic Games. But word is spreading, when the other teams that were there, for example, the Netherlands, who lost in the 24 semi-final to Uruguay, Switzerland are very interested as well because they lost in the final to Uruguay. People are aware of what these teams can do. So there is a lot of comparison going on in the press, and that's what we see a lot in terms of saying, Boca are very solid, but they're not as exciting as the Uruguayan team were last year. Oh, Paulistano are playing a much more exciting game, but they're probably not as good in defence as Nacional or Uruguay were. So all these comparisons are going on within the French press and some of the other kind of presses where these teams go on tour as well.
Gary, it's quite an irony, as Pete mentioned sort of at the beginning there, how Uruguay have come over and won the Olympic gold medal, and then all of a sudden we have a club side from Uruguay coming over, a club side from South America, a club side from Brazil, and all of a sudden, instead of it, do you think there was a little bit of a changing of roles where all of a sudden it was the mighty Southampton that were travelling to South America, and we talked about it being such an event. The president was there to see it, and now all of a sudden you have this, a club side coming from the Olympic gold medalists. You have a club side from Argentina, a club side from Brazil. Do you think this is where there's a slight, almost not a more equilibrium in terms of being, I suppose, like rock stars on tour, isn't it? It's all of a sudden it's European fans, European people wanting to see South American footballers rather than the traditional South American public wanting to see European footballers.
Yeah, I think that's a good call, Stu. When Uruguay won the World Cup, obviously, it was probably a massive shock for the European football, and all of a sudden these gods of are South American, that it's exotic. Nobody knows anything about them. It's not like today where we've got everybody knows about club teams in Brazil and Chile in the 3rd division or whatever, if there is such a thing. But in those days, it was really exotic, and it's interesting. I just very briefly flip through a couple of the tour details. Boca, for example, they only conceded a goal in many of the games. I think they conceded 2 in the last game, but only 1, and they only had 2 real bad results. It's really strange. It must be. I'm sure there's a reason for it, because they'd won all the games pretty much coming up to that point, and they lost 4-0 to Real Union on the 2nd of April, and then 3 days later they lost by 4-2 to Athletic Club. Both were played at the San Mamés in Bilbao, but so Boca was, that was only 2 games they lost in the total tour. And when and actually, I had a great record as well. They started off the first games 3-1, 5-0, 0-0, 7-0, 4-0, 3-0. They were going great guns. And the Palestino, when they arrived in France, they played the French national team in their first game, 15th of March, Pete mentioned earlier, the Ides of March, and they beat France 7-2. And there was a thing in the paper, in the French newspaper, in Le Journal, they called Palestino, sorry, mate.
Before we get in trouble with the Chilean fans saying Palestino have never gone to Europe.
Yeah, sorry, buddy. Paulistano, the Roi de Football, the Kings of Football. So that impression, the fact that France were on a particular losing run at the time is neither here nor there. But so the teams that went and Paulistino, is that right, Pete?
Yeah. Paulistano.
Paulistano, forgive me.
You're losing points in the phonetics classes, Gary, here. It's dropping down to a B now.
I'm going to talk about Nacional in a minute, so it'll be easier. They only lost 1 game. They won every game except for some reason lost a single game, and Friedrich was in his pomp, then scored a lot of goals, and so they were making a massive impression when they came over. So I think it was a big thing at the 24 World Cup when Uruguay won. So it set the scene, and these clubs came over and started proving the point.
I think, Stephen, you and I could probably both agree that there was clearly, we need to look at those player diaries for what happened in Bilbao for those 2 defeats on the 2nd and 5th of April, because clearly I reckon there was a night out somewhere. on the night before, clearly somebody had arranged some sort of an event leading up to that Real Union game. But in all seriousness, these, as Gary's gone through there, the sheer success of games. Obviously, there's a victory there against Real Madrid, but obviously we equate Real Madrid to the Real Madrid that we know now. But even so, it's still Real Madrid, and these. Certainly, from on Boca's tour and the tours as well before, as Pete mentioned as well, they really do. It sort of hit the ground running. This Olympic victory is then reinforced by three nations and their club sides.
Absolutely. Within that, from their perspective, they've still got a point to prove. This wasn't any kind of lucky hit. That Uruguay swung in 24, and here they come, and they prove it. But what's interesting as well, it's the blanket interest as well within certain nations. Pete, intimated to it, but looking through those first three, tours, the outpost that they took in was unreal. This wasn't kind of like just one or two cities being taken in. This was a proper kind of like tour of Europe. They went through France, Switzerland, Portugal, Spain. Belgium, Austria, even Czechoslovakia would tip up. Germany, Netherlands, Italy. That unsurprising lack of British outposts. It's kind of like they go through Paris. The Rouen, Barcelona, Madrid, Bilbao. They go all over Spain. They're up in La Coruña, Vigo, all sorts of places as well. They're all over the place. Through Germany, Frankfurt, Leipzig, Berlin, Munich. The interest in this must have been absolutely huge. Clearly piqued by the Olympics and the size of football at the Olympics at that point in time. It is the international barometer for world football. There is no World Cup at this point. The fact that FIFA eventually turned around and say, we'll throw our own competition. Where should we host the first one? Uruguay, and rightly so. Yeah, what's quite telling is just how you've got to look at it and think the tour T-shirts would have looked magnificent. Absolutely magnificent. That list of venues on the back would have been absolutely magnificent.
I think there's a high likelihood that the Rolling Stones were supporting that tour as well, even back then.
Oh yeah, and they were saying it was the last time.
I was going to say, and it was the final world tour. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think Mick and Keith were well on with that as their final tour. Pete, any information on what the big mystery night out was for the Boca lads before they faced Real Union?
Yeah, no, I think one of the things I read about was there's a great article by Juan Simon that was actually looking at this is an academic article that's looking at how the Spanish press received the Boca tourists. And we talked about last week that a couple of years previously in 1922, I think it was 1923 maybe, I think it's 23, the Basque Federación Guipuzcoana go across to Argentina and Uruguay and had a really poor tour. And again, we talked about how there was a lot of drinking and excess and partying there. And that did not go down well in the Basque Country. The Basque Country is seen as being a bit of one of the centres of Spanish football at this time. Quite a lot of the players that had won, I think, the silver medal in the 1920 Olympics were from the Basque Country. So this was really a source of pride. So that team actually kind of disgraced themselves in lots of ways. So when Boca Juniors come back, this is the first chance that all of those Basque players that are still left and the next generation have got to kind of say, right, we are the touchstone, we are the emblems of the Basque Country at this moment. We let ourselves down in our first international match. We haven't had a chance to play Argentina. This is our chance to play against supposedly their best team. And it is worth mentioning that this is not just a Boca-only team. There are 5 or 6 other players from certain other clubs that are on tour as well, including Manuel Seoane, who is one of the kind of great forwards at the time, known as El Chancho, the pig, but very good forward in his own right. And they also have Cesario Onzari, who is the first scorer of an Olympic goal, a goal direct from a corner. And that was actually scored against Uruguay, only months after Uruguay have won the Olympic Games. And actually, it was only just after the law had been allowed for you could score a goal direct from a corner. So there are a couple of players that are very good, but national identity and national importance and national pride are very much at stake, and we do see this quite a lot in some of the games. There's an instant where I'm trying to think. I think it's Nacional are playing down in Seville against Betis, and Betis are in danger of relegation, so they don't put their full team out. So they lose, and there's a great deal of anger in the press about this, because this is seen as being letting down Andalusian football, it's letting down Sevillian football. To a lesser extent, it's letting down Spanish football. And then it's up to the next couple of games that they play on tour to earn that pride back. And I think this is why we also see, each of these teams in their regions being very, very keen to play these teams when they're coming. We see a lot of select 11s. There's almost always a Catalunya 11, but there's almost always a Barcelona 11 as well. And they're quite regularly kind of sides representing different areas of France, different areas of Switzerland as well. And this is so it's a case of regional pride or city pride or national pride to be playing against the best of the continent. And I think going back to the ideas about why they're so excited about this is that there's a lot of this kind of the exotic other. I think it's not too long before we're having tales of cannibals and savages and great journeys through the jungle and across the pampas and meeting kind of gauchos and so on and so forth. So the kind of stories that are being told about South America are quite lurid. There's one kind of cartoon in an Argentinian newspaper called Critica, which is quite a populist newspaper, and they kind of are laughing at themselves in a way about the idea that they think they think Europeans will have of them. They say they kind of have this picture of this kind of indigenous kind of savage wearing a kind of headdress and a kind of leaf skirt and so on, and then juggling a football, and all these kind of European types with monocles and bowler hats and so on are looking on in amazement and saying, this is what we think the Europeans think of us. They'll be shocked when they see indigenous savages that can play football. I mean, you just have to remember that only the last year, with Jose Andrade, the great Brazilian kind of centre half, probably the first black footballer to play in the Olympic Games, and a lot of the time in Europe as well. And he was a sensation. He was the black marvel. But part of this is because he is exotic. So I think we can see a lack of knowledge, a lot of ideas about these kind of marvels and exotic others from the third world, suddenly coming to marvel us with their exotic talent. I think there's a little bit of that as well.
Yeah, the cartoon is a great cartoon. Actually, it was in the article that you recommended earlier. It is a great cartoon. Gary, there seems to be a lot of, when you compare, we'll come back to Southampton in a minute, but when you sort of, as Peter was saying there, the sort of nationalistic pride that went with these clubs representing their country, and then, Pete also mentioned, the Basque region, they see it upon themselves to represent their region in these games. Everything we've talked about, that sort of, that link, that feeling, that ethos is there, apart from when the UK clubs go across. It's almost, I'm not sure that Southampton went representing the south coast of the UK. I think Southampton just went for Southampton Football Club. Likewise, Exeter City and so on and so on. But yet everywhere else, there seems to be this pride, this regional pride, this nationalistic pride, but not by us.
That's a really good point. Actually, I hadn't really thought about that, but I think you're probably right. Yeah, I don't know why. I guess when the first three tours, there were a Uruguayan team, an Argentinian team, a Brazilian team. Perhaps they were just considered a Uruguayan team, a Brazilian team, an Argentinian team, rather than a club team. And Pete mentioned, I think the Brazilian team took a lot of guest players along. I looked at the stats of them. There's quite 3 or 4 players who went as guest players and never kicked a ball. I mean, it just seemed a strange thing to do, but there you go. So they weren't actually necessarily all players from that club, but yeah, it's an interesting point. And perhaps the teams, the clubs that went across from the UK to South America were, I would say, famous, but certainly more well known than because they were, when the South American clubs came to Europe. I think they were probably, as we just talked about, they were some different world. That weren't from a different league, from a different continent. They were from a different world. It's an interesting point. It's interesting. And no, I don't think Southampton were representing the South Coast. I think that Ono she would have gone to Exeter.
Stephen, do you think there was? This is a really difficult question. I apologise, but I'm going to ask you it anyway. What do you think was the British perception of this going on, and the fact you listed the tour dates on the T-shirt, and yet as a UK we weren't on it. Now, just your opinion. How do you think that was perceived by people back home, by people here?
Well, it's just sheer class snobbery, isn't it? That's what it comes down to from a UK perspective. This is a nation where it's kind of like, let's not take part in FIFA. Oh, let's take part in FIFA. No, let's withdraw from FIFA. Oh, you're throwing a World Cup. Oh, we're not going to take part in that because we don't need to prove ourselves as the God's gift to football. It's just all of that total and utter entitlement, sense of entitlement that still exists in this godforsaken country at times. And that's what it comes down to, without a shadow of a doubt. But, as ever, it puts the UK massively behind the curve that everyone else is now automatically on. Rattled off all those nations earlier on. Spain, Italy, Germany, every single one of them beat the UK to the punch in far as, embracing players from South America and from further ashore. We don't embrace South American players on a more regular basis until the Premier League era, really. We've only recently done a 1980s podcast where we were still saying that the arrival of Mirandini at Newcastle in the summer of 1987 was still seen as a ludicrous circus act. It's insane. That we were that far behind everyone else. And this is where it comes from. These are kind of like the seeds that are sown. And for the UK, it's just that complete snobbishness. Basically, we are superior. I don't add myself in that way. That's kind of like the royal we, because obviously I'm not English. I'm Scouse.
Can I just chuck something in, Stu? I mean, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things I noticed was going through the research and about representing the countries. When Gimnasia y Esgrima, Argentinian team, went out in 31, there's a couple of things that the press, the Argentine press, reported about their games, and not only the success, but how it was something that the other clubs from the other countries couldn't do. And I just quote a couple. They played Real Madrid in the first January. It said they played Real Madrid, who had not been able to be defeated either by Boca on their tour of the 25th or by Nacional to Montevideo when they went out. And Gimnasia went on to win 3-2. So not only that they're saying, we won, but we did something that the Brazilian team couldn't do and the Uruguayan team couldn't do. And there's a similar thing. They played Sparta Prague in March. And apparently that they said the Sparta Prague were unbeatable. Not even the Olympic champion Uruguayan team had been able to beat them. Before the game, the local fans were showing the 5 fingers on their hands to our boys. They've already predicted the result. But the tourists ended up winning 3-1 on the snowing playing field, taking away their undefeated record against South American teams. It's just interesting that, this Argentine, the guys reporting these Argentinian games were sort of saying, not only is South American football, but Argentinian football is better.
It is a great point. And to be fair, it's what I want to talk to Pete about next is press and the ability, we talked about the previous episode, the use of propaganda when these tours were reversed and it was British clubs coming over to Argentina and, is it Critica, the name of the publication, and El Grafico, and just, what how the press use these tools for propaganda. But just for that, I would just like to put out, I really hope that Dave Bowler has got Aidan Williams' song about Mirandina on its own recording track, and every time Mirandina's name is mentioned, do we get a rendition of Aidan Williams, and then back to the podcast again.
We've got Mirandina. He's not from Argentina. He's from Brazil. He's fucking brilliant.
So yeah, Pete, now Aidan's finished his song. It's the press and how the press perceive these early tours to Europe, and how they use it as to emphasize nationalistic pride, how they use it to emphasize or to as propaganda, how they use it to almost arguably based on the cartoon that you mentioned earlier, but change and alter that perception of what Europe has towards South America.
Yeah, no, this is a really important point. I mean, there's been a couple of articles written by Julio Friedenberg, who I'm actually kind of doing a bit of research with Latin American on British referees in Latin America. So he wrote an excellent article that looks at just the role of Critica, which is a kind of populist newspaper in Buenos Aires. It's a nightly publication, a newspaper that very much reaches out to a lot of the working class. We have a kind of much more literate working class now in Buenos Aires because they're much, there's better pay. For example, there's another article by a guy called Matthew Karash as well, who writes about, again, Critica, but also looks at a couple of the other newspapers like La Nación, which is slightly more of a middle class publication. And there are slight differences, but essentially what they're both doing in lots of ways is saying that the nation is very much at stake here. This is a patriotic endeavour. There is an attempt, particularly by Critica, to make the Boca Tour look like Argentine embassy. And again, this is really a constant of all the clubs that go. We can always see that when Nacional go on tour, when Paulistano go on tour, when Colo Colo going on tour in 1927, they're seen as being a kind of travelling embassy that has a great deal more potential to create a visual impact of what South America is, and what Argentina, Chile, Uruguay and Brazil actually is, by showing a lot more people, and actually people that count, not just people at the embassies, people at trade delegations or consuls. So all four of the first teams that go abroad, when they're received back home, the newspapers all make the same comments, and the journalists that go along with them are all making the same comments, that these were our embassies, these were our ambassadors, these amateurs. And again, a lot of them are working men, particularly the Argentinians and Uruguayans, less so the Paulistano players. There's a few more of the elite of Sao Paulo that are there on tour, but they are the travelling embassies, and there's a lot of efforts to make other fans see this as well. What Critica does, for example, is they make a big effort to show that these kind of petty rivalry with River Plate, with San Lorenzo, are actually have to be put aside so they can appreciate the fact that it's Argentina. And Critica, for example, reports how the San Lorenzo captain puts a statement out saying he wishes Boca Juniors luck and he knows that Argentina is on tour. And apparently there are River Plate fans who are seeing the boat off as Boca Juniors head off, and there are also Argentinos Juniors fans there. And again, the way that they're writing, just describes them and saying, we all have to be proud of them. This is us on show. Our nation is at stake. We've got a kind of quote here that from Critica. This is from the Julio Friedenberg article. He says, "That noble blood, when it is required for the supreme noble effort in order to gain laurels for our sport. Therefore, the strength of the race, of this Argentinian race, full of energy, is shown firm and vibrant, generous in victory, resigned and stoic in defeat." So we have two things going on here. We have the importance of the sporting performance, which is showing the quality of Argentinian men and the quality of their play. But also we have is an attempt to show a modernity of technique, a modernity of style, a science of play, but also fair play. So it is really important, and again, something that La Nación does a lot more than La Crítica does, for example, is extol the importance of promoting a good form of play, a correct form of play, good manners. La Nación also actually says that, and this is actually from the Matthew Karash article. They say that it's important for them to be like polo players. We have to be like the polo players in the Olympics previously. We have to show that kind of same level of behaviour. So I think this is really important because, again, we have each of the four tours that I've just mentioned, the Boca Juniors tour, the Nacional tour, the Paulistano tour, the Colo Colo tour. There are journalists from various newspapers going out there, and they are telling the stories of how these teams are doing. And they're commenting not only on how they do, how they play, but also how they're seen. So it's very important for the people in Argentina and Chile and Uruguay and Brazil to know that they are being seen in a good way, because suddenly they're not any longer, the savages of Latin America. They are citizens of modernity. They are citizens engaging in modern European first world cultural activities, not just sporting activities, but cultural activities. You have to see this as being amateur endeavours still. This is not just a sporting competition. This is culture. This is modernity. This is our nation on show. So how the kind of construction of a sense of us is being made by the journalists and how other people are seeing us is critical. And I think one last detail about this kind of nation building that's going on through the press is that all four of these nations are kind of have had a lot of immigration, particularly Uruguay and Italy and Argentina. We've had a lot of Spaniards, a lot of Italians have travelled to Argentina and Uruguay. And very recently too, we're not looking at, 200, 300 years. We're looking in the last 30, 40, 50 years. So we've still got a lot of Italian Spanish who maybe still see themselves as maybe Italians or Spanish first, and maybe their children are still seeing that as well. So there is a kind of importance of uniting us, making ourselves all Argentinian. And there is no talk at all about any of the Nacional team or the Boca team being any way sons of Italians or sons of Spaniards. They are criollos. They are Argentinian. They are Uruguayan, first and foremost, welcomed in, part of this new nation of Argentina or Uruguay. And, we are all part of this same success. So all those kind of things are going on in the press.
Absolutely fascinating. Gary, as a press comment, I want to talk about as a press campaign, and we're talking about realistically, as Pete mentioned, 1925 to 1931. So it's a relatively short space of time. But there's all the things that Pete's talked about there, nation building, perception, diplomatic representation by amateurs playing football. It's an incredible campaign by South America in a really, really short space of time.
It absolutely is. Just a quick thing about what Pete says about the Creole nature of the teams, and I studied quite a bit of the Boca tour, and I might have missed one, but the only English name I can see, Anglo-Saxon name I can see in the entire teams that played all those games is a guy called Cochrane who played in the second game against Celta Vigo. But so the Creolisation of the game is obviously taken over, as Pete mentioned. Just a couple of how important, it is for South America the South American contingents to show how successful they were. Not only the players, but also how the country's developed. I mean, there's a thing that was reproduced in Argentina that was in. I don't know whether I haven't got the name of the Spanish newspaper that they said it in, but it was reported after Gimnasia had beaten Real Madrid. It said the headline was Argentines seem to have been born to play football. I mean, that sort of thing, you're back in Argentina, you find out what your team's doing. It's a massive thing. There's another thing. They beat Dusseldorf combined team in Leipzig in Germany in late February 31. And after the game, it was a historic event that a reporter sent a radio photograph of the goal scored by Ismail Morgada. And it was the first time a radio photograph had been sent by anybody in the world. And this is made a big thing about this, not only the goal, but the fact that they could do this to show that, Argentina was it's a developing country. It's technologically improving and it's up there. It's a modern country. And it's a big thing that not only that South American teams were, and the South American contingents were only selling the football, but their culture as well was important to show that this wasn't the backward. Pete described the guys dancing around in grass skirts, and that this is a modern countries.
And another thing about this, Steve, as well, which also fascinated me when I was reading this, that the perception of the press, of the South American press, whatever, is they liken the European football to almost being functional and machine-like. But the Argentine press start to cultivate this image of certainly the Argentine football team being wily and cunning, and that's not meant in a underhand way, but it's sort of almost set the precedence. But even now, I would argue that perception, you look at Maradona and 86, and that, and that's nearly sort of 60 years after the event, but that perception of Argentine football is almost sealed during this time period by the Argentine press.
Perceptions and stereotypes in football can last for generations, absolute generations. We mentioned earlier about cartoons and caricatures in magazines and papers and things like that, and that's what the image of these teams and players from everywhere. You can throw the UK and Northern Europe into all that. We all have our own specific national stereotype. It's the Germans are always kind of like magnificently efficient. The Dutch, they're always kind of like either absolutely brilliant or dysfunctional. It's Italy. They're always volatile. They'll win you the tournament or come close, or they'll be having rotten fruit thrown at them once they get back to the airport. We all have these national stereotypes, and they do. They're so hard to shake off in that respect. And here they are, kind of like earning these stripes very, very. In some respects, Uruguay are the only ones that butt that trend, because these World Cup successes, these Olympic successes that they have, come in an era when there's very little footage of it. So they have a double-sided coin to this stereotype. There's the Uruguay of like the 1986 World Cup and all the violent intent, but scratch below the surface, or not even below the surface, you just look further back and there they are as a double World Cup winning nation who effectively won 4 World Cups when you throw the 24 and 28 Olympics into the equation. But very, very much these kind of caricatures, stereotypes, perceptions, whatever we want to call them, they stick like mud or shit. I'll just throw shit into it. They stick like shit.
Thank you for that quote. I'm sure that'll go in the blurb for this podcast. Absolutely no problem.
Absolutely. Oh, well, yeah, I'm proud of that one. I'll say that.
Excellent, representing the Scouse brotherhood there. Excellent, thank you. Pete, these styles, these perceptions of like I say, these touring sides that come. What I'm also interested in is the wider impact that these tours have. Like we say, it's quite a small window that we're looking at. But, we've already talked about, as Gary mentioned earlier, that the massive impact that they have and the galvanizing effect they have through the press. But away from football, so culturally, politically, diplomatically, is there even more that comes from these 6 years?
Yeah, no, I think there are. I mean, I think carrying on with the style aspect, it's really interesting to see that what kind of narratives are being portrayed about them, because we do have this sense of opposition. I think that a lot of the Argentinian, Uruguayan, Brazilian correspondents had really compared their football to British football. This provided a new point of comparison as well. So I think that they are looking to see what is Spanish football, what is German football, what is French football. And what are they saying about us as well? I mean, I think certainly, again, the way that there is a reporting of what the foreign press are saying about them, that, for example, there's a Madrid newspaper that says about Boca, they have a completely different style to the Uruguayans. They perform in a brilliant manner with clean and safe play, which is interesting, actually, because we've often associated, Argentinian teams with slightly more individualistic flair. Certainly when Borocoto, a journalist in El Gráfico, is seen as being one of the journalists who articulates what the Rio Platense style is supposed to be. He's certainly talking a lot about creativity, and this Boca team seems to be more efficient in the way that this Madrid newspaper was talking about. He also says that apparently the Real Madrid team, when Boca played them, were actually the team that were more using the gambetta, the dribbling, the tricks. Also, it talks about the Galician newspaper said the Boca players have more technique, speed and awareness. They get unmarked well. They play with precision. They're masters of the football art. So we see more sense of flair there. I think what we can see, though, is the Paulistano team certainly seem to have more flair when they're talked about. There's a couple of newspapers, that have been reported about the French press, about what they said. And apparently the French press said, these Brazilians are naive or mocking. They begin by offering a palm of flowers with the colours of their country, and then they did a kind of sorcery to finally give us a beating with all the rules of the art. Being individually remarkable with feints, Brazilians don't forget they work for the team, and so they pass and receive the ball with all speed, practicing, in short, that famous Latin game. Somehow there is already a famous Latin game that's come out of nowhere that presumably is from Uruguay, maybe from the stories of the first teams from Britain. Maybe there's kind of word going across, but that is there, which should be ours if we had as much technique as visitors. With different qualities, the Brazilians were, for us, equally terrifying opponents, and this is thanks to their speed, precision, and personality. So we see, I guess, what Steve was talking about is this is where a lot of those imaginaries are present. I mean, they're even present when they talk about Friedenreich, who Gary mentioned earlier, the kind of first great Brazilian forward, Artur Friedenreich, and also about another forward called Araken Patuska, who wrote a book about the tour called The Kings of Europe, which is what the French press call them. And when, again, this is a French press writing about Friedenreich and Araken, El Tigre and Le Danger, the danger. That's, Tigre was Friedenreich, danger was Araken Patuska. Both complemented each other. The first, thin, slender, looking just like a mascot, was the brain and heart of the painting. From his energy, from his plays, from his always fast, fulminating, skillful, disconcerting action came the advances and the dangerous charges of the Paulistano team. And then we have the other one, Le Danger, Arakan. The other was quite a permanent danger. He would shoot at the goal with either foot, and his shots seemed to contain dynamite. As young as the goalkeeper, but no less extraordinary. Each figure that was analysed allowed the observer to write columns and columns about the value of that team. So that just gives you a little bit of a flavour of this kind of impression that's caused in terms of the images. I think we go back to your question about the cultural impact. What we can see is a kind of renewing of certain cultural legacies and heritage. Certainly the Colo-Colo team, when they go to Spain and when the Spanish press receives them, there's a lot being said about the Chilean players going to learn about their heritage, kind of making connections with, their forefathers, the Spanish Empire. And we have the Spanish government trying to reach out again to its former colonies. This is the last of the Spanish colonies in Cuba and Puerto Rico had been lost in 1898. And kind of Spain had a kind of period of national decline and soul searching. And there's an attempt to try and reach out and establish a sense of brotherhood, of hermandad, with their former colonies. So we see certainly reports of shared blood, shared history, shared cultural practices that starting to appear. And this is kind of part of the fact that King Alfonso, when Boca Juniors is there, goes to meet the team. And a lot is made in the Argentinian press about the fact that the king will shake the hand of every single Boca player. And a lot of these players are workers. These are people that are not elite amateurs. They are kind of from a lot of the working class districts. So the fact that Alfonso is shaking a hand is seen as being, a very impressive gesture, even by newspapers that don't really appreciate the monarchical area. But we again see these kind of diplomatic missions. We see, mayors, we see consuls, we see important figures attending games. Certainly when Paulistano go to France, there is a very important banquet them with the kind of relatives of the previous Brazilian emperor, who was there. I think the Duke of Braganza is also present at that banquet. Now, Paulistano is a slightly more upper-class delegation that's sent. But they have taken pictures of the people training, of them at dinners of the Paulistano club. So they can show these to the people they're playing, saying, this is our culture. Look at what we do. These are our kind of athletes, how serious they train, how much fun they have, how sportsmen they are, how cultural sportsmen they are. But this is also our club with how we behave, how we have dinners, how we engage in cultural practices as well. Because again, remember, a lot of the clubs that are formed are not just a football club. They are social gatherings. They're social places for elites, in the case of Paulistano, but also other members of society to get together and have different types of cultural events, music events, talks, and so on and so forth. So we have political kind of demonstrations. We have attempts at creating greater links, particularly with Spain, but to some extent with Italy as well. Again, thinking about a lot of Italians that have gone over to Uruguay and Spain previously. And also we have this attempt to kind of show this kind of cultural side. And again, I think you've got to remember that Argentina, Brazil and Uruguay are very important economic nations at the time. They're exporting, certainly Argentina and Uruguay exporting a lot of beef, a lot of wheat, a lot of sheep, a lot of wool. And these were things that other people are looking for in Europe. So, there's lots of things going on. It's not just football.
Gary, it seems that sort of, people these days think that football has a rather inflated sense of importance, but actually this sense of importance isn't a contemporary or current issue. It goes, as Peter's taught there, it goes right back almost to the very early beginnings of the game. You talk about kings, presidents, emperors, all in attendance for this sport and these games. Football's sense of importance, or even football's importance, never mind its sense of importance, but its importance across culture and society really has always been there. This is not a new thing.
No, it's not. And, the very fact that these teams that we're seeing, of course, stop calling teams, the clubs that were going across to the first few tours were sort of regarded as national representatives rather than just sort of club teams on tour. It's interesting Pete mentioned about the Alfonso XIII. The Colo Colo added a couple of late additions to there's a team in Mallorca at the time was called Real Sociedad. Alfonso XIII, and they played 2 games against them. Whether that was some kind of sort of, thanks for being nice and welcoming us aboard. But yeah, it's a good point, Stu. I think it's very true, mate. Yeah. Colo Colo actually played just down the road from me, 2 places. I played at Murcia, which is probably, 30, 40 miles away, in Elche, which is our local decent side. I played in Elche as well. So if it had been, I can't go back to the,
I was just about to say, I was going to, did you get a ticket?
But, the memory is there. I'd also played in a couple of times. I mean, I was a key game in Valladolid. We might touch on later, a tragic game, which I'm going to in a couple of weeks as well. So, yeah, we'll follow Colo Colo on the tour.
You were part of that world tour, Gary. Don't worry about it. We'll get your name added on the tour T-shirts. Don't worry.
On the T-shirt.
I really hope the merchandise departments these clubs we're talking about are listening, because if they don't form a T-shirt or a leather jacket with all these kind of tour dates on the back, then they're really missing a trick there.
Yeah, we'll get free merchandise. I'd like to think that we get sent tour T-shirts each as part of this.
If I listen to Steve, he'll have Captain Caveman on the front and the tour dates on the back.
Yeah, totally.
Looking back, obviously the Industrial Revolution, etc., is part of what initially takes football to South America. It's what we talked about, Pete talked about earlier in the earlier series of the South America files. But again, football always seems to be at the forefront of modern life as well. It's although it seems archaic at times, and it's, like I said, it's its sense of importance, and it's just a game and so on and so on. But it is actually, or it can be argued that it also helps to shape future, whether it's through future politics, future directions, cultural shifts, societal shifts. Football is one of those things that is always there at the forefront of change.
It does, and it's just how quick that change is in the big scheme of things. Here we are saying Southampton set sail for South America in the first decade of the 19th century. Yet here you are in 1925 with kind of like this first 3 sides striking out from South America to tour in Europe, and not just tour in Europe. It would have been totally understandable for them just to be kind of like stuck to the Iberian Peninsula within that, but they don't. They stretch out across the quite a breadth of Europe within that. But also as part of that, you've got that first kind of that trailblazer. The South, suddenly Europe are looking at South American players and thinking, actually, we'll give you the game. You'll come and play for us. Hector Scaroni, who played in the 1930 World Cup final, is, if not the first, one of the very first. He plays for Barcelona. He scores against Barcelona for Nacional in that Nacional tour of 1925. He's a Barcelona player in 1926. He spends a year there, scores goals freely, and then goes back to Nacional. 1927, clearly with an eye on, the Olympics are coming again, and then there's the World Cup beyond that. And then, he eventually tips back up in Europe, beyond the 1930 World Cup. But, from the 1930 World Cup onwards, you do get these instances of more and more South American players being picked up by European teams. With Scaroni, he's kind of like pre-World Cup as being a South American player that Barcelona. And yes, Spanish football at that point in time is a little bit more rudimentary. It's not what we know it now. But these still like the biggest clubs of that era in Spain, and historically and all the way up to contemporary times. There's Barcelona picking off a player from Nacional. There is no compunction. We've mentioned, or I've mentioned, that stuck up British way of doing things. There's none of that elsewhere. They welcome these clubs with open arms. Whether they took them seriously when they landed or not is another matter. But they said, come and play here, and they did. And then there's a player who's impressed enough in the Catalan capital for them to say, well, come and sign for us. That cycle, that full turning of the wheel comes very, very quickly. So from like I say, from Southampton and Everton and Spurs and all those early tours of British clubs going to South America, to the South Americans coming to Europe, and South American players started picked off by European teams, comes within a generation.
It is fascinating. Although, again, Pete, I don't know if you know of anyone at Southampton Football Club, if they want to do a tour T-shirt as well, because as literally the birth of South American football, that tour can have all sorts of names on the front of its T-shirt. But my other question, I don't know if you'll know the answer to this, but Stephen's alluded to it a couple of times in his own imitable style. But why didn't they come to England or the UK?
It's a really good question. I mean, I would love to know if there was any attempt to try and get games in Britain. One of the things that you can pick out is that the original offers that are made to Uruguay to tour happened straight after the 1924 Olympics. We'll talk about why they didn't take these up next week. I think we'll leave that one. But that's the interest starts in Europe. It starts in kind of France. It starts in Netherlands. It starts in Spain. And we do see that there are kind of certain impresarios that are trying to create these links to help these teams tour. And they are often, Spanish speaking, for example, or maybe French speaking. So I think certainly the Boca one, there are Spanish representatives that are helping them make this tour. I think it's the same with Nacional as well, if I'm not mistaken. I think there is a kind of a link there. So I suspect that they see the first chances to make money is in being Europe, because there is an audience that is aware of them and knows how good they are. I don't know if there is any attempt made to play in England. Certainly the academic articles I've read make no report of it. I do also think that there is still this sense of potential apprehension about what would happen if we play the English professionals, given that they are still the point of comparison. Again, remember that in 1924, there is no British representation in that Olympic Games. There is no British team, either amateurs or whatever. And again, that is still seen as being the acid standard of what proper football is. So I think that if you have any kind of worry about the level of where your football is, what you don't want to do is go abroad to England and get absolutely smashed. Bearing in mind that however much they've said, oh, we're as good as these English teams, the last British team to tour, the last two British teams to tour were Third Lanark and Plymouth Argyle before this. So we're not talking about, the very best teams of 1920s England. So I think there might be a bit of fear there. I think there might be a lack of willingness to go abroad and play the very best and have your national pride smashed straight away. They've seen they can play against the best that the rest of Europe has to offer. So maybe that's just kind of, the limitations of things. I'm just going to give you one little anecdote going back to that question about football being at the forefront of technology, and it's something that quite tickled me in terms of the kind of cups that were awarded. There is a kind of tradition of awarding spurious trophies for some of these representative games that happen. So all three teams wander back to Europe with various kind of trophies awarded by local dignitaries and companies. But it's very notable that Nacional played Barcelona for the Copa Alfa Romeo, which Nacional won. So, they have think about cars and the importance of this industry. A few years later, we haven't talked about the Peñarol team. Peñarol go to Europe in 1927. They don't play Barcelona for the Alfa Romeo Cup, but sadly it's for a local perfume shop, Mirurgia. So they come back with the Copa Mirurgia, which is a perfume shop. So, again, 2 years previously, it's Alfa Romeo. 2 years after it's Peñarol, it's a bit of perfume. So that's what you win, the kind of the great trophy. But also how, I suppose these kind of sponsorship deals is very much at the forefront of football as well.
Tell you what, if you're filling that trophy with perfume, you're going to smell nice, aren't you? At the end of the game, you're going to smell a lot better at full time when you start dabbing that on yourself.
They went back with a sweet smell of success then.
Excellent, Gary.
Sorry.
Thank you. No, that's okay. Gary, quick question for you, Gary, which is kind of related, but it's just something that popped in my head, as it does when Pete was chatting. The importance placed on these, and Pete makes a great point about the level, not to underestimate the level of professionalism that was happening in this country and in Scotland, within, the highest levels of professional football, and these are very much amateur players from South America. But also England specifically as a nation has other sports. It's not just, cricket. There's cricket tours to Australia. There's rugby. There's hockey. There's, the Empire. It's almost like England or Britain or the UK has got too much going on. It's got too much on its plate to sort of cope with all of these. Whereas in South America, it seems very much all about football.
It's an arguable point. There are others. One of the things we sort of learned when we were doing one of the previous South America Files series was how football so often wasn't the first game in South American countries. It'd be cricket and rugby, and they had rowing clubs, and polo is big in Argentina as well, of course. So that's possible. It's a possible thing. But I guess it was important that for the Spanish-speaking countries, Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, Portuguese, to go to the countries where perhaps the language would have been far easier as well. The culture would be similar, so perhaps they were easier to get to. I don't mean geographically, but I mean easier to sort of get to culturally. But I guess we've said a couple of quotes about how the press sold the success of the tours. They didn't sort of say this is okay. We beat a French club or a Spanish representative side or a German representative side, but we've got to remember these aren't in England. I don't know. It's interesting. It's an interesting point. When Pick mentioned last week about the gap that there's no English tours, and it's an interesting one. I don't really know the answer. I don't know if we all really know the answers. Lots of sort of theories I guess we can put forward, but yeah, I can't see England being too busy to make any money. English clubs being too busy to make money. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gone on tour to South America. I don't know. It's an interesting point.
For you, Stephen, I want to probe a little bit more about your perception of Anglo-Saxon ignorance. And this is also another question that popped in my head, and it's just a point of interest on your opinion for this. But when do you think that Anglo-Saxon ignorant? Can't think of the right word. Or ignorant.
That's the right word.
That perception of English. When do you think that changed?
Oh, I thought you said when does it end?
No. Well, maybe that's it. Maybe it hasn't changed. But yeah, when do you think? I'll give you a decade. It's your answer. And if you don't think it has,
I think for some it probably hasn't. But for many it has. And there's a lot of us under no illusions, and I've been for a very long time. This is now. I don't know. Certainly. It's a nation that kind of like looks for influence elsewhere more now than at any other point in my football watching existence. You only have to watch games from down the divisions. And I went and watched a Conference North game, and some of the ball that they're trying to play the balls out of defence and stuff like that, and thinking that's what's going on at 6th tier level, and it was brilliant to see. It was scary at times because there was one poor lad got caught on the ball, and the goalkeeper, because he was dossing around 40 yards out, he got chipped, and it was glorious in so many ways because the team that conceded had the bravery to kind of like play that way, but B, the attacking team, the goal scoring team, had the impudence to say actually we're going to catch you out for this. I think. It's like there's never been an epiphany, and there's never been a eureka moment. I think it's just worked on a drip basis. You could probably you can point to South African players coming over in the 50s. You can point to the Robledos in the 60s, and little instances here and there of continental flavour tipping into English football. But the 70s. Kind of like the arrivals of Muir and Tyson and Veer and Ardiles, and again it's that greater access to kind of football makes you switch on all the more. So you're watching World Cups, unfold, and suddenly it's kind of like So I think it's worked on a drip basis, and that drip has been very, very slow for a long time. Mirandinia Klaxon, here comes Aiden. So we've got that, but that's less than 40. What are we now? Less than 40 years ago. We're still it's still being looked at and pointed at like some kind of circus attraction. Espria arrives in the mid 1990s and kind of like, again, it's still seen as a little bit out there. Yeah, he comes and he charms everyone with the style of football that he plays. And then suddenly it's that little bit different. And then, it's so probably 30 years, 20 years, you could probably track it bit by bit, decade on decade, just how, it's embraced over here. But, there's still a long way to go, because of the way that British football has kind of set itself behind the arc from word go. They're always going to be playing catch up. They're always going to be, several steps behind the rest of Europe and the rest of the world in doing these things.
I only asked the question because it, like you said, when you made the comment, it kind of blew my mind that, as I know it, but it's only when it's framed in this sort of discussion and context, when Uruguay, win 24, 28, 30, that dominance, that almost that decade of dominance. And it, the Olympics both happen in Europe. Yes, the World Cup is the other side of the world in South America, but yet there's still that refusal to acknowledge or that belief that we are still absolutely superior.
Well, you go look at the mentioned Hector Scaroni, and that is nearly 100 years ago now that Barcelona are picking up a player from Nacional and saying, "You come and play for us." So for 100 years, teams in mainland Europe have been kind of like saying to South American players, actually, we quite like you to come and play for us. And that escalates again, even more so after the 1930 World Cup. Again, because of the brilliance of Uruguay and Argentina there as well. But 1988, 1987, we're still looking askance at Aidan Claxon, Mirandinha.
We've got Mirandinha. He's not from Argentina. He's from Brazil. He's fucking brill.
That doesn't make people switch off. Nothing will. Or switch off.
I ain't never listening.
Oh, yeah, he will now.
But yeah, you put it in those contexts that for 100 years, Barcelona have been, absorbing South American influence. Yet the British game, not so much on a regular basis, maybe only the last quarter of a century, maybe the 30 years.
It is frightening. It is absolutely frightening. But Pete, before, as we sort of come towards the conclusion here, one question that I would like to ask, and I don't know if there's an answer to this or whether it's a very obvious answer, but like you've talked about the amateurism in concept of these players that come in, but what were, whether it's physically, tactically, mentally, socially, culturally, the differences between South American players and European players at this time?
I mean, this isn't something that is there a huge amount. I mean, there's a little bit of detail in Eduardo Galeano talks about some of the professions of some of the Uruguayan players. That Jose Nasazi, the great marshal, the great captain of the Uruguayan defence, was a marble cutter. Someone else worked as a grocer. I think someone else worked in the meat factories. We haven't talked about Rampla Juniors at all, which I hope we get a little bit of time to talk about their tour. But they had their goalkeeper, Enrique Ballester, who ends up being the goalkeeper in the 1930 World Cup, was a tractor driver in the Swift meat freezing factory. So, these are kind of, a lot of them are working class players. It's hard to talk about them physically. You look at the pictures of those teams. And even you look at some of the kind of footage of the 1924 World Cup, and there is some of it there. I mean, I would urge people, and again, we'll talk about this in the next episode as well, but I would urge people to go and look at the footage that exists of 1924 and 1930 and Uruguay playing. These people look like athletes. They're not muscular necessarily, but they're skillful. They're thin. They're kind of athletic. They're agile. So it's hard to say that there's really a kind of physical difference, really, in terms of what we'd expect a sportsman to look like. I think there's stories, for example, of Andrade, the kind of the great black kind of marvel, the Uruguayan player who clears a ball off his goal line in the Italy 1928 semi-final Olympics with a scissor kick. So these are athletes, they're not just kind of, amateurs walking about the pitch and, dropping handkerchiefs. There are a few of them playing in hats here and there. That does happen. There's a few photos of certain players with wearing hats. Some of the goalkeepers do, for example. But, these are athletes of their generation. So I don't think they are physically outdone. I think that certainly there is a little bit of some reporting of some of the games against the Spaniards or the German teams that are more reliant on more physique and rush and aggression and direct play. There are little bits of talk about those. I mean, I would love to try and find. It's one of the languages I don't unfortunately speak. I don't speak German, but if there anyone who is a German speaker, I'd urge you to go and have a look at some of the German newspapers in 1925, 1927. For these various tours and see what it was that the German players and the German press are talking about for that style. Because I think that would be very interesting. In lots of ways, I think there's probably more of a potential culture clash there in the type of football that maybe is being played in Central Europe to maybe that's played in some of the Latin kind of teams where there is probably more of a sameness of physique or a sameness of, you hate to generalize cultural philosophies, Latinidad, Latinness. There is that kind of generalization of what Latinness is. So I think that would be interesting. There is an interesting story of, I think that I was looking at it's actually ready for next week, but I'll kind of talk about it now, that there was a couple of German players, one of which got sent off, I think his name was Kalb, who was rumoured to be about 2 meters tall, who, apparently some of the Uruguayans were quite worried about in terms of when they saw him, but Nasazi stood up to him straight away. The great kind of marshal apparently got better with the stronger and the bigger the opponents were. And I think something that's said always about the Uruguayans is that they have two styles of football. They have the kind of the English style of ruggedness as well, because a lot of their football came from that. But equally, they have that kind of style that came from John Harley and the Scottish school as well. So they knew how to play, but they also knew how to mix it. And I think you can say that certainly the Uruguayan team in 1924 and also the Nacional team in 1925, could play both types of football, which is why on their tour of 30-something matches, which was a lot longer than either the Paulistano Tour or the Boca Tour, longer than all the other tours apart from Colo Colo. I think Colo Colo have a very long tour that involves places in South America and the Caribbean as well. It's worth just realizing just how much, how many, what kind of different styles they have to playing as they played in 9 different countries over something like 6 months. I think that's a slightly rambling answer, but that's probably the best I can give.
No, I like it. Although I do want to be on the Colo Colo tour. If I had to pick a tour, if it's taken in the Caribbean as well, I think that's definitely the tour that I would have liked to have been on. Don't forget as well, by the way, guys, that the little segment that I've added to the end of this is where you get to tell me your favourite anecdote from one of these tours. So yeah, obviously, Gary, you've got 2. Yeah, that's fine. There's always room for 2 for you, Gary. Don't worry, that's just a given. Gary, again, as sort of there, this, it's almost reverse pioneerism. I don't know, that's not a word, so please don't all write in that that's not a word. But these teams, these club sides that are coming to Europe, it's almost pioneer work. And we talk these sort of bigger clubs, Nacional certainly, and Boca, that we associate with big clubs. But again, it's not just big clubs that do this. It's there are the Exeter cities, if you like, that also take it upon themselves to embrace this, like I say, this pioneering travel. These are big undertakings, these journeys. You're not hopping on a plane and you're there in sort of 12 hours. These are a long, big, expensive commitment.
They are, yeah. And just a quick bit about Pete mentioned about the amateurism, the amateur status of the players in South America compared to the European. Luis Monti, who played for Argentina in the 1930 World Cup final, was later snatched as one of the Orunde, which I think we're going to discuss in a later episode. But he worked part-time for the Buenos Aires Council to eke out his wages, and this was a guy who played in the British World Cup final. So anyway, just move on. There's a Pete mentioned this team a few minutes ago, Ramplas Juniors, who are a Uruguayan team, and hardly, I mean, personally, I hadn't heard of them before, but they had a great tour in '39. And I've got one of my anecdotes about this. Is a really fascinating one. But this, how important it was. There's a guy called Esteban Arellano who was a journalist who was in part of the tour contingent. He wrote at the end, and this also takes into account what you said about the sort of physical exertions the players took. So this is at the end of the tour. We've experienced episodes whose memory will never be erased from our minds, facing all obstacles, fighting against every type of inconvenience, enduring cold and heat, snow and water, large teams of opponents. We're crossing Europe in all directions and freezing in their physical frame 289 hours on the railways. Rampla Juniors team sent to Europe obtained wonderful conquests, amazed large numbers of fans, and wrote for the history of this institution, perhaps the most wonderful of its pages. Oh, wonderful little effort at that too. But interesting, 289 hours on the railways, and that's when they're there. They might get on the steamer to get there. So it's a fascinating little thing about that. The exertions that they took to get complete the tour, and obviously, it's a money raising thing as well. But they've played in Spain, they played in Germany, they played in France, they played in the Netherlands, they played in France, they played in Spain, they played in Portugal.
I mean, Rampla Juniors, I was just going to make a joke that if they'd been on tour in Britain, it'd have been twice that amount on the trains. It'd be about 550 hours.
I was going to say, that sounds like the Transpennine Express that they took round.
But only if there wasn't a strike involved.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, then they'd been on buses for another 30 hours as well. I mean, Rampla Juniors, you can almost argue they had the best tour of anyone, considering that they were not a big team. But they played against several league champions of European countries. They played against Deportivo Español, Olympique Marseille, Tennis Borussia, at football, not tennis, Ajax and Benfica. So they played against 5 different champions in 5 different countries. And they only lost to one of them, Deportivo Español. And again, you look at the way that these tours have established, particularly in Rampla Juniors' case, but also in Sportivo Barracas, which were another small team that had a good tour around Europe. It's another Argentinian team. I mean, Rampla Juniors, you will find emblazoned in various parts of their website and fan pages the fact that they managed 9 consecutive games without losing, which is something that Nacional didn't manage and Peñarol didn't manage either. So Rampla Juniors will proudly proclaim that they had the best, unbeaten streak of any Uruguayan side in Europe. And they were also the first Uruguayan side to beat a British team. And again, as we can imagine, it was the disgrace of the British nation for this happened to Portsmouth. Is anyone surprised about that?
Wouldn't have happened to Southampton, would it, Pete?
We beat Rampla Juniors on the same tour, so there's the comparison.
It's all about identity and pride, as we've said all along. It's not about learning and education and sharing and nation building. It's all about being better than Portsmouth. Stephen, I suppose we've sort of covered. I suppose we looked from 1905 to 1931. We've looked at European tours to South America, British and UK tours. Plus, we did look at some European clubs as well. We've looked at South American clubs, coming to Europe. Is this the point of, I want to say, the point of overtaking, or the point of an equal footing between the two continents, and where, is this sort of period, this 25-year period, where you now have the two global power bases for football? Is this the period where this is established?
It's kind of South American football's 1960s, basically. It's the Harold Wilson white heat of technology and all that type of stuff. Like early on mentioned the space race. It's all very 1960s,
The Jetsons. Is that what you're telling me? It's like the Jetsons.
It's a little bit of the Jetsons meets the Flintstones.
Excellent.
It's one of those crossover episodes. It's very, and therein lies the Hanna-Barbera for to go along with my Captain Caveman t-shirt. It is very much that way. I think that kind of, it's got that air of excitement and that air of the unknown. There's a sense of mission about it, because the setting sail for kind of like uncharted territory and measuring themselves against what Europe has to offer, apart from the UK, who pull up the shutters quite predictably.
Yeah, quite predictably.
Yeah, they just shut the door, turn the lights out, and pretend no one's home. Don't
just get behind the sofa. Yeah,
they'll go away if we ignore them.
Seem like carol singers. Pete, before we come to the anecdotes, anything else that certainly Gary, Stephen, and I should be aware of with regards to South American clubs touring Europe?
Yeah, No, I think one of the most important stories really that we haven't touched. We haven't really talked a lot about Colo Colo, but I think that tour is such an important one for Chilean football and their club. It mostly surrounds around about David Arellano. Now, again, people who are ardent followers of the South American files will have probably heard a little bit about this when we talked about the Santiago episode in the second series. But Colo Colo are on tour and they're in Valladolid. Gary mentioned it earlier, and they're playing Real Union. And unfortunately, David Arellano, who is the hero of Santiago football, of Chilean football, of Colo Colo particularly, receives a blow to the stomach and will die the next day. And it's so important that this becomes like the first martyr on foreign soil. He is seen as being the pioneer who put his life into football. He had been really the founder of Colo Colo in many ways. People might remember that Colo Colo was a schism club. They were all playing for Magallanes. And then in 1925, only a couple of years before this tour happened, David Arellano applies to be captain of the club with the support of most of the players, but the club presidency refused to allow it because they see him as potentially being this route towards professionalism. He wants to change the ethos of the way football is played, is trained, and the kind of the Magallanes directors are against this. So Colo Colo is set up as a rival club, and there's quite a lot of rejection to them originally. But when they start playing really good football and start portraying themselves as the club of the people, and they have this image of Chileanness with the kind of Mapuche leader of Colo Colo, this indigenous symbol, which I think we talked about at the time has nothing to do with the state of affairs in Chile. The Mapuche are very much the marginalized other, but somehow we're allowed to take their symbol of Chile, of Indian fight against the Spanish conquerors. So Colo Colo is David Arellano's club, and the fact they go on tour 2 years later, and again, are being very much the embassy, the pioneers, the first people to take Chilean football to Europe, and for him to die on this tour is hugely important. There is a massive funeral for him in the cathedral with the archbishop giving a talk, and again, all of the newspapers are extolling his virtues. It becomes a political issue that when he is, there's one of the, I think it's the Partido Demócrata, says we need to get this man back. We need to repatriate this hero of the nation. And one of the things that is, a kind of lasting impact, not just this patriotic values, the martyr, the sense of sacrifice, is that the Colo Colo players will put a black band around their arms on their white shirts to commemorate this death. And from there, that's become a permanent feature of the Colo Colo shirt. So this is from this tour. This is a kind of like a foundation moment in lots of ways for Colo Colo as an institution, creating prestige for themselves, for the Chilean nation. The reports when they're on tour in Mexico that Mexicans didn't even know that Chile was a country. It's quite a nice anecdote. So this gives you this idea of the kind of heroes that went, and they weren't. Some of them have been forgotten for history, but others of them have had an absolutely colossal impact on, their very institutions. These are the tours that, some of the first heroes of Chilean football, Uruguayan football, Brazilian football, Argentinian football, this is where they're made. Whether it's Friedenreich or Arecampa-Tusca for Paulistano, or Seoane, Onzari, Tesorieri for Boca and the other teams, Andrade, Scaroni, Petrone, and so on, and all the other players that do well, even the Vasco da Gama players. We haven't talked about the Vasco da Gama tour at all, but, we have a few more black footballers playing in Europe, like Fausto, for example, one of the great kind of early midfielders of that kind of 1930s Brazil. So this is really important. These kind of players are commemorated, are lionized, become heroes. There are monuments about them. Boca Juniors, actually are awarded the honorary league title winners just for having played in Europe. They didn't participate in the championship, but they're given another star on their shirt for doing this tour. There is a monument to the Paulistano team, for example. There were banknotes created of the Uruguayan football team in 1924. So all of these tours become part of this in this kind of memory. And again, we've talked a lot about what you need for football to be important. Memories, success, heroes, a style of football that becomes your own. We haven't really talked about it and put it all together, but probably now we can put it all together. All of these things are present over these kind of 6 years of epic stories, of journeys all the way across Europe, of playing in snow, of playing in different countries, of different difficult referees and so on and so forth, and even deaths. So it's a really, really important period to embed football as a heroic national narrative within all of these different South American countries.
That's brilliant. That's absolutely brilliant. Gary, what Pete's just talked about there, which was brilliant to listen to. But it's, over here, I don't know, I keep going back to the England analogy, but I don't know if it helps people with context, but, people talk about sort of post-1992, the changing landscape of certainly English football and British football over here. But it's almost impossible to comprehend the shift in such a small space of time. This is 6 years, and we've just listened to Pete talk brilliantly there about all those elements, those stories, that the impact, the shifts, the changes, the stories that are still told, the memories that are still there, the statues that still commemorate, and so on. And yet it's in such an incredibly short time span.
Yeah, it is. I can just mention a couple of things about Ariana that Pete was talking about. They played, Colo-Colo played 2 games in successive days. I mean, this is the craziness of the tours against Real Union up in Valladolid in Asturias. And they beat them 6-2 the first game, and Ariana scored. And 2 days later, he was dead. I mean, basically, after he was taken from the field after he had a collision with a guy called David Ornia, who was playing for Real Union. And he's taken to the room at the Hotel Ingles in Valladolid, where the club was staying, and he's treated by a doctor there who basically failed to diagnose the issue, and he died the following day. And this is how quickly things it's just crazy things took place. But it's interesting that the funeral took place on the following day, the 4th of May. And the Spanish Football Federation apparently paid for part of the contributed to the cost of the funeral, and it's attended by a lot of people in the city. So there was a lot of respect paid to him. But yeah, so going back to your point, yeah, it's a massive explosion in a short space of time. Taking up Stevie's metaphor about the space race, the rockets were launched. It was a massive acceleration, yeah, in a short space of time.
A final point from you on all of this, Steve, and it's something we come back to quite often, but it does illustrate the unifying, as well as we know the divisive power that football has, but the unifying power and the ability to unify a nation, a region, a continent, on perhaps arguably on in this case, but it just goes to show the incredible power that football had, even in the early part of the 20th century.
Absolutely. I mean, you look at the Boca Juniors tour, and when they set sail, 22-day odyssey to cross the Atlantic. There's upwards of 10,000 people that wave them off in as if sending lads off to war or something. It has this kind of jubilation to it, and clearly there's this sense of expectancy in sending their team, their best, to go and pit their wits against whatever Europe can offer them, basically. And it clearly has a massive unifying effect as their team set sail for Europe.
I'm gonna ask you for your anecdotes now, Pete. I'm not going to ask you first, Pete. I'm going to ask you something else first. Do you want to wait till the anecdotes are over, or do you want to give a little teaser trailer about the next episode, or do you want to wait until after the anecdotes for that?
I think we can wait till after. We've kind of teased it. We can say it. We've kind of mentioned it a few times. So I think we're going to talk about the Uruguay Olympics, the 24, the 28, and the first kind of international tournament encounters in 1930 as well. But part of this, as Steve will be delighted to know, deals with the first ever Liverpool players to win an international world trophy. They weren't Liverpool players from England, of course, but
it all counts.
Just get a star put on the shows for that.
It all counts. It's kind of like the bootleg Beatles. We accept them as our own, even though they're clearly kind of like a tribute act. That's all fine.
Okay, so we've come to the part that I created last week, and it ended quite well actually with Stephen. I think Stephen had the best anecdote from what I can remember. Last week, where they picked up another football team who'd got shipwrecked. So the bar is quite high or quite low, depending on how you like your footballing anecdotes. Whether you like shipwrecked football teams, then obviously it's quite a high bar. If you want it on-pitch related, it was a low bar. However, so Stephen, you can go first this time as the reigning anecdote champion. I've now just created a competition out of it as well. So I'm going to judge each one and a one. So you've got your 1-0 up at the moment.
Excellent. I like this competition. I'm going to go for Victoriano Caffarena. He part-funded Boca Juniors tour in 1925. Must have had a fair bit of loose change down the back of his sofa. And he went essentially as, he was that integral to the tour. He was billed the 12th man, which kind of Boca have since had 100 years of kind of selling themselves as the 12th man of their team, and it comes from him. So he tagged along for the tour. He filled whatever kind of void needed filling. He was masseuse here and there. He is billed as being prop man as well, which kind of like intrigues me. Why does a touring football team need a prop man? And it leaves me thinking that, is it kind of like big oversized shoes, like clown shoes and big clown pants? And, they go to him, any player that needs a big, huge red nose or something like that for whatever reason. There's Victoriano. He has all the props that all the players could possibly need. I doff my cap to him.
I have an image of him in jeans that are a bit low cut, a t-shirt, and he's actually the roadie, and he's the warm-up man at the centre of the pitch, getting the crowd going, and just taping down wires and cables and things.
But then he walks on with a bag as well, an all-star bag, and he opens it up, and a full ladder comes out of it. and the whole crowd are just kind of like, how is he even doing this? How is he doing this?
I like to think that props is written on his bag as well, so in big black capitals, the prop bag.
Absolutely, and he's a master of disguise as well. He'll tip up at half time and they won't even realise it's the same person. That type of thing.
Excellent, Stu. That is a strong start for an anecdote. Gary, can you beat the prop man, 12th man story?
I'll try. This is a game, I've got two. The first one it concerns Rampla Juniors, and a game that Pete mentioned earlier. They played this game, believe it or not, on the 1st of April, 1929, against Deportivo Español. And basically, it's 0-0 all the way through the game. And 5 minutes from the end, the referee, a Spanish referee, a guy named Villena, gave a penalty to the Deportivo. But the Deportivo player was that embarrassed because it was such an obvious hometown decision that every player refused to take the penalty. And that actually the goalkeeper's the only guy who came forward and took it and scored the winning goal. And the Barcelona journalist wrote that Rampla's fury and class was not defeated by Deportivo, but by referee Villena. So that's interesting. But this is my best. This is a favourite one. This is a good one. This confirms good ships as well. So we're going to Palestino's tour. And the last game they played in Lisbon, and they were playing a Portugal select team. This is the 28th of April, 1925. And they were winning 6-0 with 15 minutes left to play of the second half. But they had to stop the game because otherwise they were going to miss the boat.
Okay, that is strong and succinct. Stopping because that is some fine margins of time in whoever arranged those games.
So 6-0 up. We only play half an hour the second half. I bet the Portuguese think, thank God for that 6 plonk now, and then there's 15 minutes to play. Call it off, guys. Go get your boat and clear off.
Clearly, they needed a roadie to organise their time. They needed a prop man.
Yeah, they needed a prop man. Yeah,
timing's a bit better. Pete, for you, the entire rest of the 6 years or beyond, if you would like to come up with an anecdote.
I mean, I've got two little ones that link with Gary's. I mean, to follow the boat theme, that seems to be very much part of the anecdote thing. I mean, we've got lots of stories about games and stuff played on deck, but apparently the boat that Peñarol went out on their tour with was the same boat that would then transport Jules Rimet, the referees, and all of the various European teams to the 1930 World Cup. But then it got sold to Japan and was sunk in 1944 by the American Army. So the American Navy, sorry. There's a random boat fact for you. So I also like the match report on the same Rampla Juniors tour. This is an anecdote, but just because Gary mentioned it. The Volodiso de Gol Sur journalist was in top form as he wrote, "It was extremely violent and a deplorable spectacle from the Uruguayan team. Nothing was lacking. There were penalties, scuffles, protests, aggression towards the referee, sendings off, the team walking off, a pitch invasion, intervention of the public forces, everything. It was a real spectacle. 2-2 was the result." Which I just love as a kind of way of summing up a game. Well, the anecdote I'm going to give you is of the Nacional team, and it kind of speaks volumes of the levels of competitions between and one-upmanship that we talked about in terms of space race. So basically, Nacional were playing a select team in the Roubaix region, and Paulistano had been past and already beaten them 5-0. So the team director, Pesquera, said that he would pay the team a prize of 1,000 francs if they could score more than 5. And of course they did. They scored 7. So, that shows that gambling does pay.
Money, the greatest motivator of them all. Okay, excellent stories, guys. As with this week, I will announce the winner of the anecdote competition next week. So I will update your score. So it'll keep the listeners waiting, hopefully, to tune into. It's our best episode next time because it's encounters, but it's the close one of the third kind. So this is the only episode coming up that we can make that comment. So it needs to be a really good one, Pete. Just putting that out there. If you could all come up with anecdotes of UFOs, that would be incredible.
If anyone's got Richard Dreyfuss's phone number, then that would be absolutely fantastic.
Guys, brilliant. As always, part 2, Encounters. Gary, enjoyed it?
Yeah, of course. I've just looked at the time. It's 1 hour and 48 minutes. It sounds like I felt like we've been chatting for 15 minutes. Time flies when you're having fun, and we've had fun, haven't we? Just had fun.
Always do. Stephen, we managed to get the Jetsons Flintstones crossover. If Hanna-Barbera are listening, it would be great if you could put one of them out.
A bit of Captain Caveman thrown in for good there as well. All T-shirts and merchandise from Hanna-Barbera, all welcome.
And Pete, get on to some of these clubs about the ideas of yesteryear tour T-shirts with support act from the Rolling Stones. That would be great. I think they would go down great in the club shops.
I think it is the way forward. I mean, I'm getting one. I'm getting Rampla Juniors 1929. 9 games unbeaten. That's going on the back of my shirt.
Gary, you can get a Chelsea one.
Yeah, Portsmouth 1956 as well. Rampla Juniors all the way.
I'll nip across to Elche and get the one when Colo turned up, so I'll get the Colo one from Elche. That'd be good.
Excellent. A Boca Juniors prop bag as well for me, please.
Guys, it's been brilliant as always. Thank you so much, and obviously Pete, thank you for all the knowledge, really, pretty much.
That's right.
All the interesting info, the education. I hope Steve and I behaved. Well, actually, I don't think we did. I was going to say behaved a bit better this week, but I genuinely don't think we did. But Steve and I will try again next week. To behave ourselves. Like I say, it's our favourite episode because it's the Richard Dreyfuss special. So we're dead excited about the next one. All that's left for me to say is thank you for joining us, and please join us next time for Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Thank you and goodbye.